This is Let's Talk Iowa, a podcast about the gap between Iowa's policies and the families living through them. Thank you for tuning in. Here in Iowa, families like mine are fighting through a broken mental health system. Let's talk about it. Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Let's Talk Iowa. It's been a while, and the first thing I need to say is that I am very sorry for the silence, for just disappearing. The truth is, I had to step away from the microphone because the story I've been trying to share and to spread, well, it came crashing through my own front door yet again. For the past couple of months, my family has been, and really honestly the past, 4 or 5 years, we've been in an all-consuming, soul-crushing battle with the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services and fighting for my own son's access to the mental health care services that he is entitled to legally, that we just had to fight for. And it's a fight for the basic care that he needs and deserves. And for a while, it was getting close to breaking me. The mental and emotional toll that fight leaves you with, I was hollowed out. Every ounce of my focus was poured into navigating the system for him and trying to still be present for my family and my students. So it's just been a very, very rough few months. And so thank you for your forgiveness and understanding in not being able to share some of the conversations that I've had with various people that the system impacts. But I'm here, and I feel like before there wasn't much for me to give. I found before that there was just nothing left inside of me to give. And when you're in that fight, your world shrinks to silence between updates. Your life is measured in bureaucratic delays. It's a relentless cycle of hearing not yet, of discovering that paperwork was misfiled by someone else, of learning that you've dropped to the bottom of another wait list that you didn't even know that you were on in the first place. It's a constant gut-wrenching feeling of being gaslit by the very system that holds your child's future in its hands. You follow every rule, you wait your turn, you do everything right. And you are met with a wall of indifference so vast, it feels like a physical thing. You begin to feel exactly like Nina Richtman on our first episode. Blamed, isolated, and screaming into a void. And it is the loneliest, most powerless feeling in the world. And this podcast isn't just a project for me. It's my life. Every piece of bad news from a caseworker, every bureaucratic roadblock, every night I've spent staring at the ceiling, replaying conversations in my head. That is the fuel for this show. And it's a strange, bitter kind of fuel, born of frustration and love, but it's the fuel. It's what I have. And this fight, as hard and as personal as it has been, has kind of stripped away every last shred of pretense I might have had. The pretense of being just a host or an observer or a journalist. All of that is gone. My resolve is fairly ironclad now. It's been forged in the fire of this battle. I'm not just telling you about people's stories. I'm a character in one of those stories, and I am living this reality every single day. And I know deep in my bones that I'm not alone. If you are listening to this right now, there is a very good chance that you are living some version of this story too. You know the names of the forms that we have to fill out. You know the feeling of those dropped calls. You know what it's like to fight with everything you have for the person that you love to access what they need. And so let's be very clear. These aren't just stories we're sharing on a podcast anymore. This is our life, and it's time we started talking about it like it is. And that makes today's interview more urgent than I could have ever imagined. Before we get there, I need to walk you through a couple of the absurd, maddening realities that I've come to know on a first-name basis. So, let's talk about network adequacy. It's a phrase that if you haven't heard yet, you will be hearing a lot about. It's a dry, bureaucratic term for a sacred but simple promise. That when the state is tasked with finding a doctor to help your child, to finding services to help your child, that the help is real, that it actually exists somewhere physically on this planet. Under the class action versus Garcia settlement, The state of Iowa is legally bound by a federal court to provide this adequate network. But let me tell you what it's actually like to get services. It starts with a hopeful conversation with your caseworker. They have the official list from the private insurance company that manages our Medicaid. They promise to start making calls. And so you wait. You check your phone every 5 minutes, and then the update finally comes. The caseworker calls back, their voice heavy with defeat. Well, they'll say, I tried the first 10 providers on the list. First number was disconnected. The second, it just isn't accepting new patients. And the third told me they haven't taken this insurance in 3 years. You're not even the one making the calls, but you absorb every rejection. Each no is a blow. You are a spectator to your own child's healthcare crisis, watching from the sidelines as the person that's promised to help you can't. Watching from the sidelines is difficult. The person that is helping you, they get lost in a city of ghosts. It's a scavenger hunt where the prize is your child's well-being. And your caseworker is sent out with a map where every road leads to a dead end. So let's talk about network adequacy. The sheer staggering absurdity is this. The state signed a federal court document promising that this network exists. It's like promising Bigfoot will mow your lawn every Tuesday. And now thousands of Iowa families are just waiting by the phone, only to be told by their caseworker that Bigfoot, once again, is an out-of-network provider. It forces you to wonder when the DHHS director here in Iowa, Kelly Garcia, put her name on that settlement document. What the hell did she think she was signing? Did she believe this network was real? Was she intending to build it all from scratch? Or was it just a signature on a piece of paper? A convenient way to make a federal lawsuit, poof, disappear, while leaving Iowa families to wander through this ghost network completely and utterly alone, while taking every opportunity to drag them to whatever source of mud is around, to take that time to beat them down until they just give up. And then she can go on her merry little way, claiming, look at what I've done, because do you hear those complaints? No, it's just crickets. Nobody's complaining, so everything must be perfect. Well, no, people aren't complaining because it does absolutely no good. People aren't complaining because you've left them voiceless. People are complaining because when they do, they just might be targeted by, say, a couple, I don't know, child abuse investigations. No, surely Iowa HHS would never weaponize their system. But yet they have. I've personally experienced it, and I'm sure I'm not alone. Now, about that settlement I've mentioned, and I'll keep mentioning that the class action versus Garcia. Let's be very clear. It's not just another government program. Think of it this way. When a company is caught doing something wrong, seriously wrong, they get sued, and rightfully so. And if they lose, a judge doesn't just tell them, hey, go over to little Johnny over there, little Susie over there, and say sorry. No, a judge forces them to sign a legally binding contract, a settlement that dictates exactly how they are going to fix the harm they caused. That company is then watched, monitored, and held accountable by the court to make sure that they actually follow through. This is what CA versus Garcia is. It is a federal court stepping in and telling the state of Iowa, you have failed so catastrophically to care for vulnerable children that we are now forcing you to follow a new set of rules. This settlement isn't a suggestion. It's a court order. It grants families like mine actual legally enforceable rights to things like, I don't know, a real healthcare system, a network of providers that actually provide the services they say they provide, and very specific mental health services. And so naturally, a court-ordered rescue plan for the state's most vulnerable kids is being shouted from the rooftops, right? There are probably billboards somewhere, commercials, public service announcements. Yeah, no, of course not. In Iowa, the first rule of the I should say Kelly Garcia settlement, of the Garcia settlement, is you do not talk about the Garcia settlement. The second rule of the Garcia settlement is you do not talk about the Garcia settlement. The third rule seems to be the fight will go on as long as it has to, often until the family goes limp and taps out from sheer soul-crushing exhaustion. And the fourth rule, this is your first time dealing with the Iowa welfare system, if you don't know this, is you have to fight. It is without a doubt the most important, best-kept secret in the state. No one knows it exists. Not the families who are bleeding for the protections it offers, not the teachers on the front lines. I have spoken to providers of these services who have only vaguely heard of it. I would bet that if you walked into the State House tomorrow and took a poll of the legislators who literally approved the DHHS budget, a majority of them would have no idea what you're talking about. Think about the insanity of that. How can you hold a system accountable to a promise it was forced to make in secret? How can families demand their court-ordered rights when they don't even know they have them? It is a promise made in a locked room, with the door bolted shut, and Iowa families are left outside, banging on the door, not even knowing what they're asking for. This gap between the promises whispered in a courtroom and the soul-crushing reality for families like mine, this is the chasm where our children are getting lost. And it's exactly why I wanted to talk to today's guest, Ken Croken. Ken Croken is the Iowa State Representative for District 97 in Davenport. Before he was elected to the State House, he served on the Scott County Board of Supervisors. That experience gives him a unique perspective, having seen these issues from a local, on-the-ground level, and now from inside the legislature in Des Moines. After my break, my conversation with Representative Ken Croken. All right, we are here today with Mr. Ken Croken, a Democratic state representative for Iowa House District 97. He is a former attorney and Scott County supervisor, and his legislative focuses are on mental health access, education policy, and juvenile justice reform. We are going to discuss today the class action versus Garcia federal lawsuit that was filed in 2023 against the Iowa Department of Health and Human Services that alleged the state failed to provide Medicaid-eligible children that have serious emotional and behavioral health needs access to intensive home and community-based mental health services. Instead of offering appropriate in-home support, the state was often pushing children into institutional placements that are far from their families and their communities. And in May 2025, the court approved a settlement that requires Iowa to expand and improve its mental health services, including the development of intensive care coordination, crisis response, and therapeutic foster care. The goal is to ensure that children can receive the care they need while staying safely at home or in the least restrictive setting possible. Mr. Croken, could you share your story, just a little bit of where your background, where you come from, what led you to public service, and particularly the areas of health and justice reform?
Sure, and thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation. I've spent most of my time in Iowa, about 25 years now. Most of that time has been spent as the government relations and chief marketing officer for Genesis Health System. And in that capacity, I've had a lot of opportunity to deal with Iowa's mental health delivery shortcomings, which, as your opening suggests, are numerous. My Republican colleagues are often known to brag about how well they manage the budget, but under allocation for essential services is not a budget management, an appropriate budget management technique. It only creates more problems, and it has, particularly in the area of juvenile care, and that has spilled into an area that's also very important to me, and that's juvenile justice. We've had, as you may be aware, the United States leads the world in the incarceration of children of color. And Iowa leads the nation in the incarceration of children of color. And last statistics I'm aware of, Scott County led the state. So I'm sitting here in ground zero for the incarceration of children of color. Indeed, children of color in Scott County are 10 times more likely to go to jail for the same offense as their white peers. That often finds its roots in lack of mental health and other care, community-based care.
And so to kind of tie into that, what are some of the biggest challenges that you've encountered that have led to this leading the nation in incarceration of juveniles? What's something that's within the mental health system or the child welfare system that you think is like the biggest barrier or some of the biggest barriers?
Well, I think you put your finger on it early on. An inadequate supply of services. It's just not out there,
Mhm.
and I think and obviously there would be some racial bias involved in all of this as well. But first step is, even if people were inclined to provide the services that are needed, those services have to be available. And quite frankly, they simply are not now. I must admit, I am not all that current on my understanding of the implementation of the CA versus Garcia settlement. That was only reached in January of this year. So I suppose there is some room for patience
Mhm.
as we roll this out, but that I'm also not seeing a terrible sense of urgency either. So I'd like to know more about where we are about making these essential community-based services available to all children, let alone children of color.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. It is very early on in this settlement process. To my understanding, it's not required to be finalized until 2032. And I think that's why it's very important that these conversations take place now so that going into future legislative sessions, maybe there can be a sense of urgency that drives this conversation, right? There is a hard deadline built in. And so these conversations need to be held early on so that the actual rollout can be structured for success.
Well, I don't want to be overly partisan
Mhm.
in this conversation, but the GOP majority in the House of Representatives and the General Assembly in both chambers has been focused on reducing spending rather than making the essential investments that will obviate the need for even greater spending later as problems worsen. This past year, we ended the session over budget, requiring the use of nearly $1 billion in one-time so-called rainy day funds just to balance the budget for next year. And that is a function of well, I think there's two factors. Well, there are many factors, but two leading factors: the implementation of the income tax reductions, which have reduced state revenues dramatically. And then, secondly, the implementation and broadening effect of the school voucher program, the private school voucher program, which is an open allocation. Anybody who applies there's no income eligibility required. So I suspect those numbers will continue to climb. And we're talking about hundreds of millions, not thousands of dollars.
So tying into that, how would you address your GOP counterparts' concerns over balancing the budget and still having the appropriate level of funding required to meet these requirements that are coming from this settlement?
Well, again, I think we need to prioritize better what are the obligations of the state, and providing mental health is certainly one of them, and providing mental health to children I think would be widely regarded as high within that subset. I mean, we also have uh, a, a a very, as you know, Chad, I also serve on judiciary and the justice system's appropriations budget. I believe that the state is in violation of its Sixth Amendment obligations to provide legal services to the indigent, and our obligation to provide, as a consequence of that, our obligation to provide speedy trials. You look at Scott County alone, and I don't think Scott County, which of course is largely Davenport, is alone in this. Many, perhaps most, but certainly many people in the Scott County jail have never been convicted of a crime and will never be convicted of a crime. They're there because of our antiquated bail system and our inability to provide a speedy trial complete with effective counsel. That's a constitutional right. That's sacred stuff.
Mhm.
And we're messing with it in an effort to put more money back in the pockets of the wealthiest Iowans.
Okay. And so you're kind of suggesting that there needs to be a hand in hand reevaluation of financial budgeting and
Sure. Again, it's flip sides of the same coin.
Mhm,
You either address this with revenue or you address it with reduced spending,
mhm.
but you can't do both. You have to pick a problem and deal with it. And if you're determined to return tax dollars, and I don't believe our tax burden is all that difficult. I don't know, Chad, that brings us to sort of a philosophical question. When I go to legislative forums, I hear my Republicans colleague talk about the need to reduce taxes. I'm not unhappy with my tax burden. I'm proud of our libraries and our schools and our public safety. And uh, I expect, as a responsible citizen, to pay for that with a fair tax burden that treats people fairly and equitably.
Mhm.
Um, our income tax reform favors the wealthiest. And now our this legislative session, legislative leaders, Republican legislative leaders, said the number one priority was property tax reform. Well, we didn't do any of it simply because we painted ourselves into this economic corner, financial corner. But what problem are we trying to fix? If we're trying to fix the problem of um, uh, uh, senior property owners who want to stay in their homes and need their property taxes frozen, I'd like to have that conversation. But if we're fixing the problem of people don't want to pay property taxes, well, that's not a problem I'm that concerned by. I believe we have an obligation to pay our taxes, and there's essentially three ways to do that. We can do it with income tax, we can do it with property tax, or we can do it with sales tax. And the least, I should say, the most regressive of those is sales tax and fees. And that seems to be the direction we're headed in as a state. And I'm not supportive of that plan. I think the people who are most able should be paying the most, and the people who are least able should be paying the least.
And I think you brought up a good point with that, the elderly wanting to be able to stay in their homes and being able to budget and plan for their property taxes on a year-to-year basis without fluctuations. And I think you're correct. And, there is a room where we can get past a partisan issue on at least subtopics within taxation,
Mhm.
right? And I think that's definitely a way that funding needs to be explored and addressed. And so I guess, how do you envision, like, if there was one thing you could do to change legislatively, they gave you the key to the castle, so to speak, what would you change in order to bring about the needed funds to access, or to give access to more mental health services at a community level?
Wow, no one's ever offered me the key to the castle
You
before,
know,
Chad. So
in my imaginary world, you are more than welcome to it.
again, I think we need to start with a blank sheet and determine, and it's a long list, but let's make a list of what the most critical needs are, and then draw a budget that supports. We need a budget that reflects our values, not our desire to save money. Certainly mental health is very high on that list, and I cast it in terms of our values, but let's also remember not to be penny wise and pound foolish by not providing people with the mental health services that are required at an early stage of all of this requires a greater expenditure of funds later. We don't, let me say that another way. I don't believe that we save money by failing to provide mental health services, because we only spend more providing public safety services down the road. Pay now or pay later, but pay you will. So why don't we find the most effective and least expensive way to address these very appropriate community needs, rather than hoping they will go away? Because if that would have worked, it would have worked by now.
Yeah, and I think I like your point there, and I think through my conversations with other legislators on both sides of the aisle, it seems like there's an agreement that it needs to be addressed. Just a basic philosophical difference on how to address it and where the funding comes from. How do you propose, I guess, that we combine this with education infrastructure? Because we know a lot of times when the balls drop on mental health, teachers, they pick it up, right? They're kind of the last line. They're working with
Mhm.
kids every day. How do you envision mental health services and education working as a team in the future?
Right. We have some programs here, and I'm sure there are others elsewhere in the state, but we have a very wonderful organization here called Vera French, named for a community mental health leader that has since passed, but and greatly missed. But they provide counseling services in the schools, not all the schools, because they're a nonprofit organization and don't have all the support they could use and would certainly deserve. But it's proven to be wildly effective in addressing mental health, school violence, all manner of problems that again only get worse as when left unaddressed and untended to. So I'd like to see more school-based counseling and services available to kids in the community and in the schools, so that we don't end up seeing them later in the justice system. One of the bills that I introduced last session, which sadly the Republican majority didn't allow to go forward, was a bill that would require, well, all but require students to be referred to community-based restorative justice programs that would, and this would be, prior to their court appearances, which, once the child has been arrested has gone before a judge, develops a record, that's going to seriously hamper that juvenile's progress going forward. If we could get these children into community-based programs before they become engaged with the justice system, they would stand a much better chance of completing their education, staying with the community, leading productive lives. Show of hands, how many of us failed to make a stupid decision when we were kids,
I'm very
And
glad there weren't cell phone cameras around when I was a child. I don't know about you, but
so you know what I'm saying. If we could get these kids the kind of help and intervention early on, I'd like to think we could obviate the need for, building one of the state's largest juvenile detention centers, which is dramatically more expensive and dramatically less effective in turning that ship around.
so what would this restorative justice look like from your perspective if you were able to design it how you saw fit?
Yeah,
Again,
well,
in,
I
in my
mean,
theoretical
again,
fantasy land here.
yeah, there's a lot of programs, and I was more active on this issue when I was with the board of supervisors. But there are some programs in Chicago and other communities where these kids with issues are assigned to. I was going to use the word mentor, but this is serious mentoring. This is daily mentoring. This is daily supervision. These are people who are making certain these children go to school and do their homework. And, it's a very intensive approach. And from that respect, it sounds, again, terribly expensive, but it is less expensive than allowing the problem to percolate and grow. We don't want that. And these other approaches work.
And I think, correct me if I'm wrong, you're kind of saying an intense intervention right away is going to cost money, sure, but it's less money than if we wait until the children are adults and they're failing at a higher level and we
Yeah.
intervene. And I think part of that ties into where generation to generation, right? I've seen in my own career in education where a struggling student grows up, they make poor choices, nothing happens. They have kids eventually, and their kids are very similar, right? Because that's what they saw mom and dad do, and then that's what they learned, right? So we have this generational issue as well. How do you envision that being addressed?
No doubt about it. Many of are the victims of poor parenting, let's call it. Pardon me. Not so many as you think. I think not you, as one thinks. I think there's an awful lot of people who are willing to throw up their hands and walk away from some of these families and say, "Oh well, there's nothing to be done." I don't believe that's the case. Most parents want their children to be successful. Most parents want their children to be more successful than they were. I think that's a biological instinct that occurs in just about all of us when we find when someone lays that little baby in our arms, something happens to most humans that makes life look very different to them than it did before. The challenges of poverty and other social ills notwithstanding, I believe that parents still want the best for their kids. We as a society, I think, need to capitalize on that asset, quite frankly, and help these young people having children, figure things out, address the housing issues. It's very difficult to be a good parent. It's very difficult to be an exceptional parent when you're faced with housing insecurity and food insecurity and employment and all those other things that we should be dealing with, whether or not there are children involved, but particularly when there are children involved. so much since I've joined the legislature because I'm in Des Moines a great deal, but I did a lot of volunteer work at one of our local schools, and I know these mothers and fathers that I met care about their kids, but they're also worried about where the next meal is coming from. Much less are their kids doing their homework? Are they being socially responsible?
I had a conversation the other day with Representative Robert Henderson, who is very familiar with like education, and we were exploring his thoughts on how this class action lawsuit would fit in with the education system. And throughout this conversation, I noticed he really wanted to emphasize community, and we spent some time talking about community and how this idea of community has changed over the years. It used to be very common for you to live right next door to your aunt, your uncle, or they were just down the block, or they were within walking distance, and how now we have more of a mobile population in general, and they might accept jobs out of state. And so there are a lot of people who, they don't know their neighbors even, right? They don't know the person that lives two houses down, and so this idea of community building was a very prominent feature of that conversation. Hearing of you, it seems similar in some aspects. How do you see the importance of community and maybe even in like intentional building of community? How would that serve to alleviate maybe some of these problems that people are facing?
Yes, and Representative Henderson is a good man. I admire him, and you're absolutely right. I grew up across the street from my grandparents. Today, we don't even live in the same area codes, much less zip codes. It's family is not as big a role. It does not play as big a role as it once did. Although I'm sure for many it still is, but uh, I think for many school-based communities and probably even more faith-based communities play a role. But again, the demands of life, I think, do separate us. And it does take a village, but the village is really busy these days. So it needs to be an intentional action on our part to introduce ourselves to our neighbors, say hello to people. But we've also sadly entered a time of great suspicion where anybody who's friendly is, looked at with suspicion. What do you want? And that's unfortunate, but I don't know what to do about it.
Yeah, it doesn't seem necessarily like you can't legislate that you go introduce yourself to your neighbor.
Right, yeah.
It's hard to
But we
address it that
can
way.
we can facilitate it and we should try.
Right. So, kind of getting back to the Garcia settlement and this, from your perspective, what are some of the guardrails that are needed to prevent the state from cherry picking or HHS specifically from cherry picking what they want to comply with?
Well, I think it needs to be evidence based. And again, we're early days here, not sure, but I think we need to spend a good deal of our time and effort monitoring results. Um, which efforts yield the best results or the most results, and again create a priority order for where do we get the most bang for the buck? How do we get people to the services that will do the most for the most? And I don't know the answers to that questions, but I'm sure there are people who are studying this and we need to listen to them. Sadly, I think that the Iowa legislature, maybe in particular, but I can't speak for all, tend to substitute their judgment for the judgment of those who are more knowledgeable. We saw that in the gutting of the area education agencies. We saw that the House last year passed a bill that would allow for the substitution of ministers for guidance counselors. I don't think that's a great idea. We need to start again back to education. Last year, the House of Representatives prescribed the American history curriculum. Well, I don't think legislatures should be developing school curriculum. I think historians should be developing American history curriculum. So the whole thing has been terribly clouded by culture war issues, and that's been a disservice to everyone. I've heard legislators discuss mental health solutions that were downright backward, and I don't think that word is hyperbolic. I we need more mental health professionals guiding policy than we currently have. Guided again by results, not by costs.
I'd like to hear that. I was speaking with another representative, and he mentioned the same thing about how providers and a lack of providers is a major issue, and how maybe reimbursement rates need to be evaluated in order to attract more providers. And then our conversation flowed into, okay, if we attract these providers, how do we ensure that those in need can connect with them, right? A lot of providers are open during normal business hours, which is when students are in school or parents are at work. And so how are some ways that you envision we could bridge this gap between providers providing service and parents and those in need having lives that don't allow them to access them during the normal business hours?
Well, and we touched on this a little bit before. This is why I'm very I'm very focused on school-based services that our children can access as part of their own day. Um, you're talking about Medicaid, and Iowa sadly is one of the lowest paying Medicaid states, often ranking in the bottom 2 or 3. There's not much financial incentive for mental health providers to come and set up practice in Iowa, which is why we have so few providers, not just in the mental health arena, but across the board. Uh, Iowa has one of the lowest per capita healthcare provider ratios in the nation now, and that's a real challenge. But focusing just on mental health, um, we need to find ways that we can attract people to the state. I was among very few Democrats that voted last session in support of a bill that would advantage Iowa residents in admission to medical school. University of Iowa Medical School. Most of my Democratic colleagues did not support that, but in the absence of a requirement that you spend some number of years in service to Iowa, I don't know why Iowa taxpayers are supporting the training of medical professionals who then go elsewhere to deliver service. So we need to find ways to create an incentive to keep people providing services in Iowa. We also need innovation. I think the expansion of telemedicine in the arena of mental health needs to be explored and exploited a great deal more than it has been. And again, that would be terrifically more convenient than and maybe less effective, but terrifically more convenient than in-person care that does require people to leave jobs and do things that put other strains on life's load.
Right. If you have, say you have to 3 initial meetings in person to develop that bond between a therapist and a client, and then maybe taper off into those virtual, right? But I think there's definitely ways that we can integrate the two to provide effective care. 2 last questions, I guess. So I don't want to steal you for the whole day. I know you're a busy person, and I just appreciate you being on the show. I hear from families, and I am one of those families where there's long wait lists, long wait times for services for their Medicaid eligible children. In your view, what does real compliance with these speedy access to services, what does it look like moving forward from here?
Well, again, I'm an attorney and now a legislator. I'm reluctant to give medical advice, but I think there and I'm proud of my history in this area at Genesis, now Mercy One Genesis. I was part of a team that helped create an emergency system for that. In some cases, people's mental health needs are emergent, and I think we need, in some cases, immediate access to treatment and care that has been available. And locally here in our emergency department, I know that there's a certain number of appointments every day at the organization I mentioned earlier, Vera French, that are reserved for the emergent mental health needs of patients. We need to recognize mental health, Chad, with physical health. We wouldn't tell someone bleeding that they need to wait 3 weeks for an appointment. We would create a mechanism or a care delivery system that was able to respond to the urgent needs of people. I think that if we could overcome that that bias that mental health is not every bit as urgent and compelling as physical health, the world would be a better place.
And I think you hit the nail on the head there. One of my previous guests was Nina Richtman, who was a parent who went through a situation where her children required significant mental health services and she wasn't able to access care. And eventually she was having suicidal thoughts herself. And so she went in to get care. And she had no one to watch her son, so she brought him with him. And that triggered a DHS investigation that lasted 9 months. She had to go through the court system, and it was just a legal nightmare. Whereas we wouldn't have done that if she had gone in with, a broken leg, right?
Right, exactly.
And so
Yeah.
I think that's a great point that you make. What, kind of going positive now, we've spent a lot of time on what we should do differently. What gives you hope right now for moving forward? I know you touched on how we need to have a clean slate, because I agree a lot of Iowa's system is a patchwork, right? And there's not a lot of cohesion between the different pieces. But what gives you hope that we can move forward and fix some of these issues?
I believe that Iowans, and please God, it's not only Iowans, but truly care about these issues. If you'll indulge me, I'd like to tell you a story. As you know, the Iowa legislature and the Iowa governor um, uh, came together to ban gender affirming care for trans children. Since that time, I have organized a number of fundraisers for Iowa kids to get that care at some Illinois based organizations that provide gender affirming care, specifically the Project of the Quad Cities and Clock Inc., that provide both social services and healthcare services to these children. And we just had a fundraiser at the end of the month of May, and I was out soliciting donations for an auction. Well, the response was so positive and so caring, but I went to one particular hospitality restaurant bar where I was talking to the owner of the facility about what I was looking for and why I was looking for it and why I felt it was important. And they were very quick to say, yes, we'd be happy to support it, and we're going to give you a gift card to auction off, and so on and so on, which was lovely. But that happened quite often to me. But what surprised me was, while I was talking, 3 different people wandered by and dropped one $50 bill and two $20 bills. People who were just overhearing the conversation and wanting to say, I care about this. I feel for these kids who are suffering, gender dysphoria, and this is an awfully specific aspect of the whole larger mental health thing, recognized psychological disorder, and why we would ban care for these children is completely unclear to me. And now with the changes coming to Medicaid, I fear they won't even be able to get the mental health support that 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 they will desperately need to survive these personal crises. But the fact that three strangers would walk by and hand me money to help these kids, that was a real feel good day for Ken.
Yeah, and in my life, I've made a very big effort to, as I've gotten older, to kind of put aside my strong opinions and just listen, right? Listen to people. And I think as I've done that, what I've gathered in my conversations is a lot of people, they want to help. There may be philosophical differences on how to help or at what age is what treatment appropriate, but I think your point of Iowans in general are very kind-hearted and want to help is a great reminder for a lot of us who sometimes can focus on the negative, right? And you start feeling defeated and you kind of get in that self-perpetuating cycle of spiraling downward. And it's moments like that where, somebody has out of the goodness of their heart, hey, here's some money,
I mean,
I'd like to do
without
what I
being
can.
asked,
Yeah,
without
100%.
solicitation, they
Yeah.
overheard a conversation. That's a good heart that does
Mhm.
that.
Well, absolutely. Yeah. No, and that's great to hear. I'm really, I didn't expect an uplifting story to be there, So just last thing, what are some of your legislative priorities next session that you're kind of working towards that you'd like to introduce? It can be
Well,
about anything.
when you're in the minority, it's difficult. A number of issues. The Iowa minimum wage is $7.25, which it has been for 18 years. When you live here in the Quad Cities, um, and the Iowa minimum wage is half what the Illinois minimum wage is, and then people tell you we need to do more to develop our workforce. That's a problem I have very little patience for. If we're not going to pay people fairly, I don't know why we expect them to want to work in Iowa. So that's something I'll be gee, there were so many. Again, I want to require or all but require that children be referred to community services before they are invested into the criminal justice system to try to head that problem off. I've also got a number of other concerns. Assisted suicide was something I've been talking about for a number of years that I think an awful lot of people would help at end of life that they can't currently get. There's just a wide range of topics, Chad.
Right. And I'm assuming you're speaking more to those with like terminal illnesses that are in
Oh,
pain.
absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
The
No.
based on laws like uh the Pacific Northwest and Colorado, and they have a lot of medical aid for end of life care, and I'd like to see Iowans have that option as well.
All right. Well, I'm definitely interested in having you on again after we kind of branch out into more policy areas because it seems like you have a lot
Well,
of
Chad, it
experience
was
and
a lot of
knowledge.
fun, and I really appreciate the invitation. Let's get back together and talk about legislative priorities when it gets closer to the session.
We will definitely do that, sir. Thank you so much for coming on. I appreciate your insight and your thoughts, and I look forward to conversations on the road.
Thanks a lot.
You have a great day, sir.
You too.
A huge thank you to Ken Croken for that conversation. When you're in this fight, you feel like you're holding your breath all the time. There's a constant tension in your shoulders, a knot in your stomach. And hearing a public official, someone in a position of authority, validate your reality, it's like you can finally exhale. Just for a second, that knot loosens, and you're reminded that no, you're not crazy. This is real. It is happening. The exhaustion I talked about at the beginning of the show, it's a soul-deep kind of tired. It's the quiet, simmering rage you have to swallow when you're being gaslit by a caseworker, by an MCO worker. It's the despair that creeps in at 2 a.m. when you're awake staring at the ceiling, wondering if you have the strength to make one more phone call tomorrow. The system is designed to make you feel that way. It's designed to make you feel isolated, overwhelmed. It thrives on your silence and your exhaustion because it knows that people who are tired and alone eventually give up. But we're not going to do that. And this is where the hope comes from. Not from the system, but from each other, from community. And so I'm asking you to do 3 things, not as a checklist, but as an act of defiance against that isolation. First, arm yourself with knowledge. Look up that class action versus Garcia settlement. I will do my best to remember to put a link in the show notes. Read it. Understand the rights your children, our children, are legally guaranteed. Knowledge is power, and right now we need all the power we can get. Second, break the silence. The loneliness of this fight is a political choice. Let's choose something else. Share this episode. Let another parent who is sitting at their kitchen table feeling like a failure know they are not alone. Ask your city council member, your county supervisor, your state representative, what are you doing about the Garcia settlement? Make the secret public. And third, raise your voice. If you are living this, I want to hear from you. Send your story to chad@letstalkiowa.com. Your story is not a burden. It's a testimony. Let's build a chorus so loud that they can no longer pretend they don't hear us. I know that this feels impossible sometimes. It's a tough fight. But I also know that we as parents, as neighbors, as Iowans are fueled by something far more powerful than bureaucracy. We are fueled by a ferocious love for our children. That is the source of our strength, and that is how we will win. Thank you for listening. I want to ask you to do one thing today. Share this episode. Share it with a friend, with a legislator, with someone who still believes this isn't happening in Iowa. And if you're a parent, a provider, or someone living through this system, reach out. You are not alone. You can email me at chad@letstalkiowa.com or find more information at our website, letstalkiowa.com. Because this isn't just a podcast. It's the beginning of a conversation we've needed for too long. Stop staying silent. Let's talk Iowa. Let's keep going. Every share helps raise awareness, and every conversation starts with a story. Follow us on Facebook at Let's Talk Iowa and on Instagram at Let's Talk Iowa Podcast for episode updates, behind-the-scenes content, and ways to take action. Because truth changes policy, and Iowa families deserve better. Truth matters. Families matter. You matter. Let's Talk Iowa. We'll see you next time. It's the beginning of a conversation we've needed for too long. Stop staying silent. Let's talk Iowa. Let's keep going.